Sloane had watched her sister move through the world with the specific confidence of someone who had never seriously considered that the thing they wanted might already belong to someone else. Petra was older by 4 years. She was polished, persuasive, and extraordinarily good at making rooms believe she was the most important person in them. She had spent 15 years building a professional reputation that their father had watched with visible pride at every family gathering. Their father had built a company over 30 years. A real one, not large by national standards but significant regionally, profitable consistently. The kind of business that represented a life's work in the most literal sense. When his health began to decline, the question of succession had started moving through the family the way these questions always moved, in conversations that happened in hallways and parking lots, and quiet phone calls that not everyone was included in. Petra had assumed the answer was her. She had been building toward it for 2 years, positioning herself with board members, establishing relationships with key clients, making herself visible in every room that mattered to the company's future. She had been methodical and strategic and genuinely impressive in her campaign. What she had not done was read the ownership documents. Sloane had read them. Sloane had been reading them for 3 years, because 3 years ago their father had sat her down in his office and transferred majority ownership to her through a properly structured legal process that nobody in the family had been informed of except the two of them and the attorney who drafted the paperwork. Petra had been campaigning for something that was already gone, and the board meeting where she planned to make her move was in 3 days. Before Sloane opens that portfolio and puts the ownership documents on the board table, hit subscribe right now. Because the moment that board chair reads the transfer deed is one of the most quietly powerful moments in this entire story. New videos every week. Hit like if you have ever held something real while someone else campaigned loudly for it. Drop a comment. Have you ever let the truth reveal itself in its own time? Now let's go back. The board meeting is in 3 days. And Sloane has known exactly how it ends since the day her father introduced her to his attorney. My name is Sloane. I am 34 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. For 3 years, I had been carrying a piece of information the way you carried things that were significant and not yet ready to be spoken. Quietly, carefully, without letting the weight of it change how I moved through rooms where other people were making plans based on incomplete information. My father had built a regional supply chain company over 30 years. I had been working in its operations for 7 of those years. The quiet structural work of making sure a company functioned properly when nobody was watching the foundation. 3 years ago, he had transferred majority ownership to me through a legal process that 2 people and 1 attorney knew about. The board meeting was in 3 days. My father's health had been declining for 18 months. Not suddenly, not with a single diagnosis that clarified everything at once, but gradually in the way that health sometimes declined in men who had spent 30 years running on will and momentum and had one day simply run low on both. He had reduced his hours first, then his travel, then his direct client contact. He remained present, sharp in the conversations that mattered, deliberate in the decisions he still made personally. But the company had been shifting its weight onto other structures for over a year, and everyone who worked there had felt it. The succession question had begun moving through the family the way these questions always moved, in hallways, in parking lots, in quiet phone calls that not everyone was included in. Petra had started her campaign approximately 2 years ago. Sloane had watched it begin and had tracked it consistently without ever intervening in it. It had started with board dinners. Petra appearing at events she had not previously attended, positioning herself beside the right people, asking the right questions with the easy authority of someone who considered herself a natural fit for the room she was working to enter. Then it moved into client relationships, phone calls with key accounts, attendance at industry events where the company's name appeared on the program. She had been methodical and patient and genuinely impressive in her approach. Sloane had watched all of it with the specific attention of someone who understood exactly what it was building toward and exactly what it was going to run into. While Petra built her external profile, Sloane had continued doing what she had always done, the work that kept the company functioning rather than the work that made the company visible. She had rebuilt the logistics routing system in year 3 of her tenure, reducing operational costs by 14% over 2 years. She had managed the company through a supplier crisis 18 months ago that had threatened 3 major contracts and had resolved it without the board ever needing to convene an emergency session. She had hired and developed 11 of the company's current department heads. None of this appeared in a 40-slide presentation. None of it had been announced at board dinners. It existed in the company's operational data and in the institutional knowledge of the people she had worked alongside for 7 years. Her father called on a Tuesday evening from the hospital room where he had been for the past 6 days following a cardiac event that his doctors had described as serious but manageable. His voice was measured and clear, the voice of a man who had made a decision and was delivering it rather than discussing it. He said the board meeting had been scheduled for Thursday at 10. He said he had spoken to the company attorney that afternoon. He said it was time for the documents to become visible. He asked if she was ready. Sloane had been ready for 3 years in the specific way you were ready for something you had been carrying long enough that the carrying had become its own kind of preparation. She told him yes. He said he was proud of her. She said she knew. Petra called at 8:30 on Wednesday evening. Sloane was at her kitchen table reviewing the ownership documents one final time, making sure every page was in order. Petra's voice carried the warm certainty of someone who had already written the next chapter in her mind and was calling to make sure the supporting characters were aligned. She said she knew the board meeting was going to be a significant moment for the family and for the company. She said she hoped Sloane would support her transition into the CEO role, that she valued Sloane's operational expertise and saw a clear place for her in the leadership structure going forward. She said it with genuine affection and complete confidence. Sloane listened to every word. She said she would see Petra at the board meeting tomorrow. She said goodnight and closed her portfolio. Sloane left her Portland apartment at 9:15 on Thursday morning, the ownership documents in her leather portfolio, the portfolio in her bag on the passenger seat. She had slept well. She had eaten breakfast. She had dressed the way she dressed for every board meeting, professionally, without particular ceremony, in the way of someone who considered the work more important than the presentation of the work. She drove through the familiar streets of the city, toward the company building her father had moved into 12 years ago, the same building where she had spent 7 years learning every operational system, every client relationship, every structural vulnerability and strength. She parked in her usual space. She picked up her bag. She walked in at 9:45, 15 minutes early, the same way she arrived everywhere that mattered. 3 years ago, her father had called her into his office on a Thursday afternoon, not through his assistant, not with a calendar invite, just a direct knock on her open door and a quiet request to come in and close it behind her. She had sat across from his desk in the chair she had sat in for 7 years of operational conversations, and had waited with the specific patience she brought to situations where she understood something significant was coming, but didn't yet know its shape. Her father had looked at her for a moment before speaking, the particular look of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally arrived at the moment of saying it. He said he had been watching both his daughters carefully for several years. He said he had reached a conclusion. He spoke about Petra first, directly and without cruelty, the way he spoke about most things that required honesty. He said Petra was brilliant and polished and genuinely capable of making rooms believe in her, that these were real qualities and he had never underestimated them. He said she had built an impressive external presence and that her ambition was authentic rather than performed. But he said he had also watched what drove that ambition over 30 years of knowing her, and he had understood something that the board dinners and client relationships and industry visibility hadn't changed. He said Petra wanted the company because of what it represented: the succession, the legacy, the public confirmation of her position in the family story. He said that was a different thing from wanting what the company actually was. He told her what he had been watching in her for 7 years, not the broad strokes but the specific ones, the individual decisions and moments that had accumulated into his assessment. He mentioned the routing system rebuild, not the outcome, but the 18 months of unglamorous analytical work that had preceded it. He mentioned the supplier crisis, specifically the Tuesday night she had spent on the phone with 3 different vendors simultaneously while managing the internal team through the uncertainty of not knowing whether the contracts would hold. He mentioned the 11 department heads she had developed, called 2 of them by name, and described specific qualities they had that he attributed to her influence. He said the company's ability to function when he wasn't in the building was entirely a product of the infrastructure she had quietly built. He said he needed someone who wanted the company itself. After he finished speaking, her father picked up his phone and made a brief call, 3 sentences, a confirmation that they were ready. He stood and told Sloane to come with him. They walked down the hall to the small conference room that the company used for legal meetings, and Sloane found a man she had not met before seated at the table with a folder in front of him. Her father introduced him as the company's estate and corporate attorney. a separate engagement from the firm that handled the company's standard legal work, specifically retained for this purpose. The attorney shook her hand and opened his folder and began explaining the ownership transfer structure he had been engaged to prepare. He walked through it clearly and completely. He said he had drafted it to be unimpeachable. He said her father had been very specific about that requirement. The process from that Thursday afternoon to the completed transfer had taken 3 weeks. Not because the legal work was complicated, but because her father had insisted on doing it properly, with every document reviewed twice and every filing confirmed through the appropriate channels. Sloane had worked with the attorney through each stage, reviewing the transfer deed, confirming the ownership percentage, understanding the governance implications of holding 58% of a company that had an active board and ongoing operations. She had asked careful questions and received complete answers. She had signed where she was required to sign and had kept copies of everything in a secure folder her attorney maintained on her behalf. On the day the final filing was confirmed, her father had called her and said simply, "It's done." She had said thank you. He had said no, thank you. 58% meant majority ownership in a company with 5 board members, 43 employees, and annual revenue that her father had spent 30 years building to its current level. It meant that any significant decision about the company's future, leadership structure, strategic direction, sale or merger succession, ultimately rested with her regardless of what the board discussed or what other family members campaigned for. It meant that Petra's 2-year campaign, however strategically constructed and however impressively executed, had been building toward a door that was already closed from the inside. Sloane had understood all of this on the day the transfer completed. She had gone back to her operational work the following morning without changing anything about how she moved through the building, or how she engaged with the board, or how she handled her relationship with her sister. Her father had asked her to keep the transfer private until the right moment. He had his reasons, and she had trusted them completely, as she had trusted most of his judgments about the company over 7 years of working alongside him. She had not told her mother. She had not told Petra. She had not mentioned it to board members or colleagues, or the department heads she worked closely with every day. She had carried it the way she carried most significant things, internally, without visible weight, in the part of herself that knew the difference between information that needed to be spoken and information that needed to be protected, until it was ready to do its work. For 3 years, the document had sat in her attorney's files. On Thursday morning, it was going to sit on the boardroom table. The difference between those 2 locations was everything. Petra had approached the succession campaign the way she approached everything that mattered to her, with preparation thorough enough that by the time she entered any room she had already mapped its contents. She had spent the first 3 months reading everything available about family business succession, academic papers, case studies, the specific dynamics of founder-led companies transitioning to second-generation leadership. She had identified the patterns that produced successful transitions and the patterns that produced contested ones. She had assessed the company's board composition, the individual members' professional backgrounds, their known priorities and decision-making tendencies. She had built a picture of what the path to the CEO role required before she took a single visible step toward it. Then she had begun. The board had 5 members, 3 independent directors, and 2 family representatives, including her father. Petra had focused her attention on the 3 independents with the patient precision of someone who understood that succession decisions in companies like this one were ultimately relationship decisions made by people who needed to feel confident in the person they were choosing. She had identified the right entry points for each: a shared industry connection for one, a mutual professional contact for another, a direct outreach framed around a genuine question about the company's strategic direction for the third. Over 18 months, she had converted 3 professional acquaintances into people who knew her name, respected her thinking, and considered her a credible candidate for the role she had not yet formally sought. Petra had understood early that the case for her succession rested partly on visibility, that a company transitioning from founder leadership needed someone who could represent it externally with the same authority her father had built over 30 years. She had pursued that profile methodically. She had accepted speaking invitations at 2 industry conferences. She had published 3 opinion pieces in trade publications under her own name, with the company referenced in her biography. She had attended the annual client appreciation event for the first time in 4 years and had personally reconnected with 6 major accounts. She had made herself the visible, external, public-facing version of what the company's future leadership could look like. The board had noticed. The clients had noticed. Sloane had noticed too. The formal succession proposal had taken Petra 4 months to build. Sloane knew this because Petra had mentioned it at a family dinner in September. Framing it as a significant professional project she was deeply invested in without specifying its content. The presentation was 40 slides. Sloane would see it in its entirety on Thursday morning for the first time, but she had known it was coming and had understood what it would contain without needing to see it. Financial projections. Leadership transition timeline. Strategic vision for the company's next decade. A comparison of succession models from comparable regional companies. It would be thorough and well constructed and genuinely impressive because Petra was genuinely impressive when she applied herself completely to something. The 40 slides would do exactly what they were built to do. They just wouldn't be enough. Petra had told their mother she was ready, had sat with her at the kitchen table of their childhood home on a Sunday afternoon, and walked her through the plan with the warm confidence of someone sharing good news they were certain of. Their mother had listened and asked thoughtful questions, and had said she was proud of the work Petra had done to prepare herself. She had not said anything that suggested Petra's assumption was wrong, not because she knew about the ownership transfer, but because she didn't know about it either. Sloane had watched her mother's face at family dinners over 3 years and had seen no indication that their father had told her. He had kept his own counsel on this with the same quiet discipline he had kept it for 30 years of running a company. Petra had told two close friends, sworn to secrecy in the specific way people swore friends to secrecy about things they were too certain of to fully contain. She had told them over dinner 6 weeks before the board meeting, had described the succession plan, the board relationships she had built, the proposal she was finalizing. She had said she was going to be CEO of her father's company before the end of the year. Her friends had raised their glasses and congratulated her, and said it was well-deserved and that they had always known she would get there. Sloane knew about these conversations because one of Petra's friends was married to a colleague of Sloane's who had mentioned it in passing, not as gossip, just as news about someone they both knew. Sloane had received the information and filed it and said nothing. The board meeting had been scheduled by the company's chair in response to a formal request from Sloane's father. A written communication, sent to all 5 board members 10 days before the meeting stating that the matter of company succession and long-term leadership structure required formal board consideration, and that he was requesting a dedicated session to address it properly. The chair had coordinated the scheduling and confirmed all 5 members for 10 o'clock Thursday morning. Petra had received the meeting notice and had read it as the moment she had been building toward, the formal occasion that her 2 years of preparation had been pointed at. She had spent the final week before the meeting reviewing her presentation, refining her answers to likely questions, and preparing herself for the room. She was ready. She had been ready for 2 years, so Sloane. Sloane arrived at the company building at 9:45, the same building she had walked into 5 days a week for 7 years, the same lobby where the receptionist knew her coffee order, and the security desk had stopped asking for her badge after her 3rd month. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, where the boardroom sat at the end of the hall with its glass walls and long table, and the particular quality of light that came through the west-facing windows in the morning. She had been in that room hundreds of times, for operational reviews, client presentations, budget discussions, the ordinary recurring meetings that constituted 7 years of working inside a company from the ground up. She walked in at 9:45 and chose her usual seat and placed her portfolio on the table and waited. Petra arrived at 9:50 with the specific energy of someone who had been preparing for a significant performance and had arrived at the venue in the precise condition she had been building toward. She was dressed carefully, the considered professional presentation of someone who understood that first impressions in rooms like this one were part of the communication. She carried a leather presentation folder and a laptop bag and moved through the boardroom door with the confident ease of a person who had decided the outcome before entering. She nodded at Sloane with the warm, distracted acknowledgement of someone whose attention was already distributed across the room. Board members to greet, materials to arrange, the final calibration of a presentation she had been refining for 4 months. She sat up at the far end of the table and opened her laptop. The 5 board members arrived in the 2 minutes before 10, the 3 independent directors together, having apparently shared the elevator, and the 2 family representatives separately. The board chair, a woman named Margaret Holt who had been on the board for 9 years and who ran meetings with the efficient precision of someone who considered wasted time a professional failing, called the session to order at 10 o'clock exactly. She stated the purpose. The meeting had been called to address company succession and long-term leadership structure following the founder's communication of 10 days prior. She noted that the founder was not present due to his current health situation, but had submitted a written statement to the board that would be entered into the record at the appropriate point. She said they would begin with presentations and moved immediately to Petra. Petra presented for 22 minutes, the 40 slides moving in the sequence she had constructed, each one building on the previous in the deliberate architecture of a case she had been assembling for 2 years. She covered the company's current position and its strategic opportunities. She outlined her vision for the next decade. She presented her transition plan with specific timelines and accountability structures. She addressed the question of operational continuity, acknowledging Sloane's work directly and positioning it as the foundation her external leadership would build on, which Sloane noted was both accurate and strategically intelligent. The board was engaged throughout. Margaret asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which Petra answered well. When she finished, the room had the particular quality of an audience that had been genuinely impressed by what it had just seen. The board's questions came in sequence after Petra closed her presentation, 4 questions from 3 different members, each one probing a different aspect of the transition plan she had proposed. The first was about client relationship continuity during a leadership change. The second was about the timeline for operational handover and how disruption would be managed. The third was a more pointed question about Petra's direct operational experience within the company, the one question that carried the most potential difficulty given that Petra's work had been primarily external. She answered it by framing her external experience as complementary to the internal operational strength that already existed, a response that was both honest and skillfully constructed. The fourth question was about her vision for the company's regional expansion. She answered it with the specific confidence of someone who had prepared for exactly that question. When Petra's question session concluded, Margaret looked at her notes briefly and then turned to Sloane with the efficient directness she brought to all procedural moments in a meeting. She said, "Sloane, you've been asked to attend today in your capacity as a senior operational leader within the company. The board wants to ensure we have the full picture before moving to discussion. Do you have anything you'd like to add at this point?" It was a standard procedural question, the kind that expected a brief operational perspective or a deferential acknowledgement of what had already been presented. Margaret had her pen ready to make a note. The 3 independent directors were looking at Sloane with the polite attention of people expecting a short answer. Sloane said yes. She reached for her portfolio and opened it. She removed the ownership transfer documents from her portfolio and placed them on the table, 1 copy in front of Margaret, 1 copy distributed to each board member, 1 copy placed flat in front of her own position. She did it without preamble, without a speech preceding it, with the same direct efficiency she brought to every operational presentation she had made in that room over 7 years. The documents were clean, the transfer deed on top, the filing confirmation behind it, the current cap table on the final page with the ownership percentages listed clearly. She said, "Before the board moves to discussion, I want to make sure everyone has the relevant ownership documentation in front of them." Margaret picked up her copy. The room went very quiet. Petra looked at the documents from across the table, and her expression changed for the first time all morning. Margaret Holt had been reading significant documents for 30 years. She had the specific efficiency of someone who could assess the weight of a legal instrument within the first 60 seconds of contact with it. She read the transfer deed from the first line to the last without looking up, her expression moving through the professional neutrality of someone processing information rather than reacting to it. She turned to the filing confirmation and read that too. Then she turned to the cap table on the final page and looked at the ownership percentages listed there. Sloane's name beside 58%, the remaining 42 distributed among smaller stakeholders. She set the document down on the table with the careful placement of someone handling something that had just become the most important piece of paper in the room. She looked at Sloane. She said, "When was this executed?" Petra had been reading her own copy with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the document in her hands was significant, but had not yet fully assembled what it meant for the morning she had spent 2 years building toward. She looked up from the cap table page and across the table at Sloane. She said, "What is this?" She said it in the flat, careful tone of someone who already knew what it was and was asking anyway because asking was the last available moment before knowing became unavoidable. Sloane looked at her directly and said, "It is the ownership transfer document my father executed 3 years ago. It transferred majority ownership of the company to me, 58%. The filing was confirmed through the appropriate state registry. The company attorney is present today to answer any questions about the process or its validity. The company attorney, a measured man named David Park, who had been retained specifically for this engagement 3 years ago, and who had prepared for this board meeting with the same thoroughness he had brought to the original transfer, spoke from his position at the side of the room with the calm authority of someone whose professional purpose was to establish facts rather than argue positions. He confirmed the transfer had been executed on the specific date noted in the deed. He confirmed the filing had been completed through the appropriate state corporate registry and that the confirmation on record matched the document in front of the board. He said the transfer had been structured to satisfy every applicable legal requirement and that he was not aware of any basis on which its validity could be successfully challenged. He said he was available for questions. The room was very still. Someone had forgot to close Petra's presentation. It was still visible on the boardroom screen behind her, the final slide showing her proposed leadership transition timeline with her name in the CEO position and a start date of January 1st. The board members looked at it, and then at the documents in their hands, and then back at the screen with the particular expression of people absorbing the full picture of a situation that had just been clarified completely. Margaret reached for the laptop on the table and closed the presentation without comment, a small practical action that nonetheless carried the specific finality of a door being closed on something that was no longer relevant to the meeting's actual business. The screen went dark. The documents remained on the table. The room held its quiet for a moment before Petra spoke again, this time not to Margaret or to the board but directly to Sloane, across the table, in the specific tone of someone who had set aside the professional register of the last 2 hours and was asking something personal. She said, "You knew. The entire time I was building the proposal and talking to board members and telling people I was going to be CEO, you knew." Sloane said yes. Petra said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Sloane looked at her for a moment before answering. She said, "Because Dad asked me not to until the right moment. I respected that." She paused. Then she said, "And because I watched you spend 2 years campaigning for something without once asking me what I actually did here. I wanted you to see that clearly." Margaret moved the meeting to formal business with the efficient professionalism that had characterized her 9 years on the board. She acknowledged the ownership documentation, noted that it had been entered into the meeting record, and stated that the board's discussion would proceed in light of the complete ownership picture now established. The discussion was substantive and professional. The board asked Sloane questions about her operational vision, her plans for the leadership structure, the transition timeline given her father's current health situation. She answered every question directly and completely. The confirmation of her role as majority owner and CEO was moved, seconded, and passed with a formal vote that took 4 minutes. The meeting concluded at 11:50. It lasted 1 hour and 50 minutes. 2 years of campaigning had been resolved in the final 22. Sloane left the building at 12:15, portfolio under her arm, the ownership documents back inside it. The parking space she had used for 7 years now, belonging to the CEO in the way it had always belonged to the person who ran the building from the inside out. She drove through Portland in the particular quiet of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally set it down in the right place. She thought about her father in his hospital room. She would call him when she got home, tell him the meeting was done, tell him the documents had done exactly what he had built them to do. She thought about Petra, not with satisfaction, not with anything that resembled triumph, just with the specific clarity of someone who understood that the morning had been necessary, and that what came next was more important than what had just finished. She drove home through the city her father had built his company in, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the particular lightness of a thing carried quietly finally carried no more.